I started off in the late 1970s and early 1980s as a middle school and high school and sometimes elementary school special education teacher in Kodiak, Alaska. I did that for 5 years. I went back, finished my doctorate by the mid-1980s. From the mid-80s to the early 1990s, I was an educational researcher. I ended up co-directing a research institute at the time, and then in 1992 I moved up here to the Puget Sound area, where I became a professor in the School of Education at the University of Puget Sound, and currently I am the Dean of the School of Education at the University of Puget Sound. And across that time I've done probably 20 federally funded grants, most in the area of math education and the needs of low-achieving kids. I mean, it goes way back, actually. When I was teaching in Alaska, about the time I finished teaching, there was this appearance of microcomputers in the context of education. And you could even see at that time that technology in itself was going to change education to some extent. Most importantly, it was going to kind of change the workplace. And I went back to graduate school, got a doctorate in that process, looked more at technology-based education. And, you know, at the time, there's even more ranting about how technology was going to change the landscape. And I continued that thinking across the 1980s. And as it got to the end of the 80s and into the 90s, then of course math reform took hold. And it all culminated in this question of how were kids who had, especially in remedial classrooms, special education classrooms, how they were going to fare with a whole different kind of curriculum that was going to push toward higher standards, toward problem solving, toward communication, toward the kinds of things that were talked about at the time and talked about today. And when you go even further into the 1990s, we spent a considerable amount of time in regular classrooms at the elementary school level, at the middle school level, looking at what happened to kids across time. And it was clear that as you up the ante, as the curriculum demanded more, it was great insofar as capable kids were able to take off and demonstrate pretty high levels of competence. But the flip side of that was at the elementary grade levels, there were kids who were falling further and further behind. And the pattern that seemed to be apparent, or at least consistent as we looked across different sites, was that about third grade, the world started to part. And you had kids who were ready to go on to higher levels of mathematics that were pretty much atypical in the past, and you had kids who needed more time, and those kids who needed more time fell further behind. And by the time you got to middle school, you found that there was a significant chunk of kids who were still operating at the third grade level or even possibly the second grade level. And then you started to look at what was happening at the middle school level, which was pretty much more of the same. I mean, whether student or districts or schools explicitly track or not, there's always some track of kids, either somewhat heterogeneously or homogeneously grouped, who, you know, are either floundering or they're kind of stuck in a rut in basic skills education. So there was this need that became very apparent as we went across the 1990s and early 2000s that some kind of intervention curriculum was really needed. One that particularly, you know, was suited toward those kinds of kids, how they learn, and move them from where they were toward algebra, which of course is, you know, is emerging as a more and more important high school kind of outcome. The research is quite a mix. I mean, you can start with, well, for one, you can look at basic skills education, particularly in the area of special education. And, you know, the question that gets asked there is what's so special about special education? As you looked far and wide in terms of services, particularly at the, you know, late elementary and especially the middle school level, kids were essentially given lots of worksheets. They worked individually in isolation, perhaps more as a behavior management technique than anything else. And that evidence, along with even broader evidence that came out through international comparison studies, American students in general were not making the shift to higher mathematics at the middle grade level, which was pretty critical. So there's sort of this base of what's wrong, and then you look at, you know, the intervention world and the curriculum, and you know, there were in some pockets with more conceptually oriented education in the United States at least, some promise, some hope that that kind of approach would make a difference, particularly when students were, you know, given the kind of coaching and counseling in terms of the importance of education, and moved away basically from routine drill and practice. The other thing that sort of influenced our work in a significant way was this emergence of international comparative education. In addition to sort of the box scores, what countries ahead and all that sort of stuff, they did some pretty powerful analyses of classroom practices. They looked at curriculum, and two big principles that came out of the research at that time were that this whole notion of fewer topics and greater depth very much guided our thinking. It's something that resonated very well with the recent National Mathematics Panel report. And the other thing that came out of it that was pretty important was the whole idea of conceptual understanding. And conceptual understanding sort of drives the way you approach instruction on a regular basis. So we fused those things together, and that was very much the way we framed the curriculum. Mm-hmm. There's a huge challenge that effectively the National Council of Teachers Mathematics Standards posed. When the standards came out in 1989, it persisted through 2000. And what they did, by some design, was to expand the range of topics that are typically covered in a mathematics curriculum. So in addition to just the typical numbers and operations kind of work that kids have traditionally done, you have the appearance of topics like data analysis, probability, which is very much absent in a lot of curriculum, a much more intense treatment of geometry and measurement, this infusion of algebraic thinking all the way down. There's sort of a good news, bad news side to this kind of emphasis. In some respects, it can dilute a curriculum. And, you know, teachers and the curriculum try to cover all these different topics in a kind of, in some cases, frankly, a haphazard fashion. The challenge for us was to figure out ways to have a presence for, you know, some of the most significant topics. In our view, data analysis was very important because it was a way of framing problem solving. Certainly the numbers and operations was critical, but not get caught up in the scheme of having to do everything at the same time. So if you look at the way it reflected in our curriculum, we have a significant emphasis on numbers and operations working toward algebra and algebraic thinking. And then, you know, the secondary strand is very much the geometry and to some extent measurement strand. And then, of course, the final strand is the data analysis strand. So we try to do that in a way that's logical, where it's concentrated in depth. The other thing that sort of led to is a structure of the curriculum where each chapter has dual topics in an effort to cover these different, you know, strands of the standards. The goals are really, really critical, and this evolved out of spending lots and lots of time in classrooms. And of course, I started off as a special education teacher, so I worked with kids at the elementary grade levels, the middle grade levels, and the high school level. And two things were critical in thinking about how you address the needs of these students. One is the whole issue of rate. I mean, at what rate do these students learn? A related issue is their style of learning, which is to say that, you know, the traditional approach to mathematics that heavily emphasizes symbol manipulation is just not enough for them. You've got to provide other kinds of supports, particularly the way information can be presented in a visual fashion. So connecting with students in the way they learn and the rate they learn is one of the primary goals. Another huge goal with the program is to motivate students. I mean, there's nothing worse, particularly by the middle grade level, with kids just not making progress. They're very self-conscious of that factor. They know that they've seen this stuff 1,000 times before and pretty dispirited by that fact. So what we try to do in terms of a goal in the program is to make a bargain with them. We're going to reduce the somewhat monotonous at times drill and practice. The flip side of it is we're going to present this stuff at a conceptual level, and we expect you to understand it conceptually. Now, the conceptual understanding guides the numbers practice, and we certainly provide enough attention to that, but it's changing the game. The final game, and this is a huge one, not just for students but for kids, is to provide a roadmap for both of them, students and kids, students and teachers, to provide a roadmap for students and teachers so they can get from where they typically are to algebra. And that's a huge one. So we're trying to solve a problem across a very precious piece of time, which is the middle school. If these kids get into high school, it's a much bigger challenge because of the organizational structures of high school to provide the kind of remedial intervention work that you need to do to get them toward passing algebra classes. So that's really one of the biggest, most intentional goals of the program. That's a real good question, and the reason why we waited in part came from the fact that in the 90s we started by looking at reform approaches to teaching mathematics at the elementary grade levels. And one of the things you see there, and you see the vestiges of it now with the tremendous emphasis that's been placed on reading at the elementary grade levels, is there's just sort of a resource void. I mean, and quite honestly, and it's unfortunate, you still have in this country a large number of teachers at the elementary grade level who are exceedingly uncomfortable with the topic of mathematics. So in addition to providing any kind of intervention support, you also have this issue in the mainstream classroom. It's difficult to get the kind of high quality instruction that you need to reach a broad number of students. The other thing about it is, I mean, elementary schools across the board tend not to have any kind of differentiated instruction in the area of mathematics for kids. There's sort of a wait-and-see attitude, and particularly as kids move to the intermediate grades, there's still a tendency to heterogeneously group kids and, you know, see how they fare. Now, that's changing a little bit, but still it's pretty much 5th grade before some schools start to take hold of the fact that they've got kids who are significantly far behind. In contrast, at the middle school level, you have kids pretty obviously grouped in one way or another. I mean, you know, granted, a number of schools say, well, we don't track. We don't track except for the fact that in most cases you can find some advanced track for high-performing kids in 1 or 2 of the classrooms. So here's an opportunity when kids move to a different kind of structure to provide more focused support in some fashion and, you know, intentional full-blown intervention instruction. And the problems are much more manifest. There are a couple of answers to that, and one has come out fairly recently in the form of the curriculum focal points that the NCTM organization published. They realized that there's obviously a richness and a breadth to their standards, but what's often lost in that is what is it our students supposed to kind of master by grade levels. So, you know, one way to answer the question, what do you do with kids in 1st through 4th, is to provide the kind of support around those core concepts, if you will, to make sure that they have that before they move on. The other thing, which is a little bit more controversial, is to think, you know, I mentioned this earlier, this whole breadth of what's in the standards, is to think more carefully with low-achieving kids about accomplishing fewer goals in greater depth. That would be my recommendation. All of that being said, the idea that in this exceedingly difficult discipline, mathematics, one that people forget about being a K through 12 discipline, you're always going to have this problem of keeping everybody at the same place. There's just this natural divide, and that was one of the first observations we found in the early 1990s. I mean, particularly kindergarten, 1st, 2nd grade teachers were ill-prepared for the quality of thinking they found in a lot of students, and that was great. That's the upside. The downside of it was it made struggling students seem that much further behind, and I think that world still exists today. As I said before, we had a core commitment, and we maintained that commitment throughout the development of the 2nd edition, to stay close to what we believed was a pace of learning. When we finished the 1st edition, we knew we weren't done. We knew that we'd gone as far as about halfway through what would be a pre-algebra class. So that was probably one of the driving forces behind creating the 2nd edition, is to have that full accounting. And that took a significant amount of rearrangement. I mean, we basically took all the lessons, went back through them. We also, as part of the process, responded to all kinds of, you know, user concerns and everything else. But in terms of the structure, and Mary and I spent a tremendous amount of time obviously having to think this through when we were doing the first 3-4 units of the program. What was this going to look like for kids? And again, what we were very much attuned to, given 2 kind of polar choices at the time. You could have this very traditional remedial drill program where kids would spend a significant portion of a period, if not the whole period, grinding through computational exercises. The other side of it is the programs at the time, and they're still being used today, call for a lot of exploration and problem solving all around one topic for the entire period. The commonality between these two poles is they spend the entire period doing one kind of thing. So thinking about the learning styles and needs of the students who are in front of us, one of the things they need is change. They need a change up in what they're doing. And so there were two things that influenced the structure of the lesson as we thought about it day in and day out. One was clearly they needed the whole emphasis on numbers and operations, or as they got further in the program with algebra. They needed that kind of experience. But there's also a time where you call it quits and then move on to something else so that you soften the amount of, focus on manipulating numbers. And that's what led us to develop this whole second strand thinking. Now, when we can make connections, it's great, but other times where you don't make connections. The major idea is the second strand allows us to address another NCTM strand, but it also lightens what's called the cognitive load of the curriculum. It isn't so demanding all the time, particularly in an area where kids often struggle. So there was that broad way of looking at a lesson that led us to a curriculum structure where every unit has these two strands. Now, again, within the lesson, the other thing that we thought an awful lot about, and this was frankly, the influence for me was having visited a number of Japanese math classrooms. What was so apparent in looking at a Japanese classroom, repeatedly from elementary schools through middle schools, every minute of the period is used in a thoughtful and productive fashion. We find, and again, the international studies at the time pointed it out, we have vestiges in this country of spending 20%, 30%, 40%, 50% of the time doing low-level drill and practice, seat work kind of activities. So in order to help these kids make gains, we had to figure out a way to structure every lesson so that kids would have more opportunities to learn and learn at a kind of higher level. So, we set up the program so that the first few minutes frankly acted as the twofold sort of thing. It was a review. Kids come into class, it's not necessarily the case to remember which class they're coming into, so the warm-up activities provide a brief review. It's a behavior management kind of thing. Kids know immediately what they're supposed to do, but then it's given over to sort of a conceptually guided component of the instruction that's interactive, where teachers model new ideas. Kids are given opportunities to solve certain, a small set of problems. Teachers can check for understanding, do that sort of thing. But then we also made sure that in each lesson, or virtually every lesson, that there was a problem-solving component that took the thinking to a higher level. So that structure also became apparent to us. And I think if there's any big difference between the first version and the second version, it's staying close to that scheme lesson after lesson after lesson after lesson. So those are the two biggest things that we sort of wrestled with in the design of the curriculum. Go back to the way the standards emerged in the early 1990s. And this is an interesting theme that goes way beyond mathematics. When you think about one of the incredibly critical components of success in a workforce today, it has a lot to do with problem solving and communication skills. And these were, twin pillars of the reform movement in the 1990s. And I think that was, very thoughtfully expressed, and I believe that's the case. So, when we push kids off into problem-solving activities, there's obviously a clear agenda there. One is to engage kids in richer thinking, particularly, if we can present problems that have more ambiguity and, different solution paths, and it's sometimes even different solutions. We want to foster activities where kids actually interact with each other. This is a real problem in low-track classrooms in particular. Kids are isolated, and so developing a culture where they work in pairs, or they work in groups, they communicate their thinking. We found that in the research that we did in middle school classrooms, when we set up those kinds of structures, class went a lot better. It was more engaging and more motivating. So, there are many reasons why we created that kind of a structure. And of course, then the idea is that when they got done, and if teachers do it right and conduct a discussion and they share their thinking, kids are exposed to different ways to solve problems, and that's a real important kind of cognitive effect. Well, I mean, there are a couple things that I would put forward as they think about teaching the program. One is, and this is our hope, I mean, how it plays out is another issue, but one of the things I think is quite rewarding if you do it right is there's nothing more, nothing more rewarding for a teacher than to have success with kids who've been turned off or struggle, with a subject like mathematics. And what that calls for, of course, is going beyond the curriculum. Christine Williams has been very articulate about this issue, that you sit down and you have a conversation with these kids about where they are, what their goals are, why this topic's important. Yeah, it's not going to be easy every time, but you're going to see you'll make progress. So the opportunity to actually engage kids at a much more sophisticated level is one of the great rewards of the program, but it's also one of the challenges. You're not just teaching math, you're also motivating students, and you're apprising them of where this particular subject will take them, why it's important, why it's now a major factor in determining whether they're going to graduate from high school, whether it's going to enable them to go off into careers in post-secondary education, whether it's a community college or whatever it may happen to be. So there's something that can be deeply rewarding about doing more than just teaching the math. It's also, how you connect with kids at a much more sophisticated level. So that would be actually one of my primary pieces of advice. The other thing is, and I think this is, in the design of the curriculum, and I forgot to mention this earlier, but this is really huge. One of the problems that we found with a variety of curriculum, either at the elementary or middle school level, is the conceptual understanding of a topic, what it means to add fractions, what is the relationship between decimals and fractions, for example. All of that was hidden from everybody. It was in the teacher's guide or it was in the professional development. We made sure that that material was explicit to everyone in the student textbook. So if you're looking for understanding the concepts, I know we have a lot of technology that supports this, but it's right there in the student's textbook. And that's a very important piece to be apprised of.